Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that's just for you. We're going to be looking at the F-15E Strike Eagle. It's a fighter jet, but it's not just a fighter jet, it's a multi-role strike fighter, which means it can handle air-to-air combat and ground attack missions. We've got some great excerpts from the F-15E's Wikipedia page here. It's got tons of information about its history and design, and we'll even get into some stories about how it's been used in different conflicts. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a solid understanding of what makes the F-15E such a unique and successful aircraft.
You know what's really fascinating to me about the F-15E is that it really turns the whole concept of the original F-15 Eagle on its head. Remember the whole "not a pound for air to ground" motto? The original F-15 was all about air superiority, pure and simple.
Yeah, you're totally right. Speed agility ruling the skies. So how do we get from not a pound for air to ground to an aircraft that can carry what seems like a whole army's worth of bombs and missiles?
Well, believe it or not, the idea of making an F-15 that could attack ground targets was floating around pretty early on, even though the focus was on air superiority. McDonnell Douglas, the company that designed the F-15. They saw the potential for a version that could also hit ground targets. And they even started coming up with designs for a fighter that could eventually replace those older F-111s and F-4s.
Oh, wow. So those planes were getting pretty old even back then, huh?
Oh yeah, they were definitely showing their age.
Okay, so the idea was there. But what was the turning point? What really convinced the Air Force to commit to building a strike fighter based on the F-15?
Things really started to change in the 1970s. The Air Force realized they needed a dedicated aircraft for long-range strikes, something that could hit targets deep inside enemy territory without needing a bunch of other planes for protection or electronic warfare support. And it turned out that the F-15, with its powerful engines and super tough design, was the perfect starting point for this new mission.
I guess you could say that necessity is the mother of invention, right? The changing needs of the military drove the development of some pretty amazing technology, like this F-15E.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about this enhanced tactical fighter program. It sounds pretty serious.
Oh, it was. It was the early 1980s, and the Air Force was determined to find a replacement for the F-111. So they launched this program, which later got renamed the Dual Role Fighter Competition. The goal was to find an aircraft that could excel at both air-to-air combat and ground attack, a true multi-role champion.
So this is where the F-15E goes head-to-head with the General Dynamics F-16XL, right?
Yeah.
That cranked arrow wing design was so cool.
It was definitely a unique design, and the F-16XL was a very strong contender. But in 1984, the Air Force chose the F-15E.
What were some of the reasons behind that decision?
Well, a few things played a role. The F-15E was expected to have lower development costs. It had a lot of potential for upgrades in the future, and the fact that it had two engines was a big plus, especially for missions deep into enemy territory where reliability was critical.
It must have been a tough choice. Both aircraft were way ahead of their time, but in the end, the F-15E won out, and the rest is history. So let's dive into what makes the F-15E so special. It's more than just an upgraded F-15, right?
Oh, definitely. It might have inherited those dogfighting genes from the original Eagle. But the Strike Eagle has some tricks up its sleeve that make it a force to be reckoned with in ground attack missions. For one thing, it has a two-seat cockpit with a dedicated spot for the Weapons Systems Officer, or WSO.
Ah, yes, the WSO. The WISO, as they're sometimes called. What exactly does the WISO do back there?
The WSO is like the pilot's right-hand man when it comes to ground attack. They operate the targeting systems, analyze sensor data, keep an eye out for threats, and make sure those bombs and missiles hit their targets. They even have their own set of controls, so they can take over flying the aircraft if needed.
So it's a real team effort in there.
Absolutely.
It makes sense when you're juggling air-to-air and air-to-ground missions.
Yeah.
So what about the Strike Eagle's design? What are some of the features that make it stand out as a strike aircraft?
One of the first things you'll notice on an F-15E are the conformal fuel tanks. Those are those sleek pods that are mounted along the sides of the engine intakes. They give the aircraft a massive increase in range without sacrificing speed like those external drop tanks do. The downside is that they're permanently attached.
So that's a trade-off, I guess. More range for a little less agility.
Exactly.
But it makes sense for an aircraft that's designed to strike deep behind enemy lines. So let's talk about the brains of the operation. What kind of avionics and sensors does the F-15E have?
Oh, it's packed with technology. Advanced radar systems, electronic warfare suites, and a whole bunch of targeting pods. One of the coolest systems is the Lantern system. Imagine flying at night or in terrible weather, trying to stay low to avoid enemy radar. With Lantern, a pilot gets an infrared image of the ground projected right onto their heads-up display, so they can see everything in the dark, and drop bombs with incredible accuracy.
That sounds pretty sci-fi.
It is.
And what about weapons? I know the F-15E can carry a ton of firepower.
It can carry just about any air-to-ground weapon the U.S. Air Force has. Laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided bombs, even those huge bombs designed to destroy bunkers. And of course, it still carries air-to-air missiles for self-defense.
That sounds like a flying arsenal.
Pretty much.
It even has that classic cannon, right? A little old school mixed with all that high-tech weaponry.
Yep, the 20-millimeter cannon. It might seem a little low-tech compared to missiles, but it's still very effective against certain targets.
And it just looks cool.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about what the F-15E can do, but let's get into where it's actually seen action. It's not just a showpiece. This aircraft has a serious combat record.
Oh yeah, the F-15E has been all over the world. It's taken part in nearly every major U.S. military operation since it first entered service in 1988. Its first combat experience was in Operation Desert Storm in 1991.
Desert Storm. That was a major moment in military history. What was the F-15E's role in that conflict?
Well, it was a pretty intense introduction to combat. On the very first night of the war, F-15Es were sent deep into Iraq to attack those Scud missile sites. They had to stop Saddam Hussein from launching those missiles at Allied forces and civilians.
So they were thrown right into the fire.
Exactly.
Were there any particularly memorable stories or incidents from Desert Storm?
There were a few. Sadly, 2 F-15Es were lost during the war. One to enemy fire and the other to a surface-to-air missile. The crew of that second aircraft managed to evade capture for days. It's an incredible story of survival.
Wow, that's amazing.
And then there's the story of how the F-15E got its only air-to-air kill of the war.
Oh, really?
How'd that happen? It actually took down an Iraqi Mi-24 helicopter with a GB-10 bomb.
A bomb?
Yeah, not your typical air-to-air weapon, but it got the job done.
That's pretty resourceful.
It is.
So Desert Storm was just the beginning for the F-15E. What other conflicts did it see action in?
Well after Desert Storm, F-15Es became a key part of enforcing those no-fly zones over Iraq during Operations Southern Watch and Northern Watch. And there's this really fascinating story from that time about how F-15E crews used a clever tactic to stop Iraqi helicopters from attacking Kurdish refugees.
Okay, now I'm curious, what did they do?
Well, they couldn't just shoot the helicopters down, so they had to get creative. They started flying high-speed passes near the helicopters, creating these huge waves of turbulence that basically tossed those helicopters around, forcing them to break off their attacks. They even aimed lasers at the cockpits, trying to blind the pilots.
That's incredible.
It is.
It shows how skilled and adaptable those F-15E crews were.
They were definitely thinking outside the box.
So they served in the no-fly zones. Where else did they go?
They were also deployed to the Balkans in the 1990s, supporting Operations Deny Flight and Deliberate Force. They used their precision bombing capabilities to target Serbian forces.
So they were pretty busy.
They were.
What about Operation Allied Force in 1999, the NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia?
The F-15E played a big role in that conflict as well.
Oh.
And it really showed off its multi-role capabilities. Crews would fly missions where they'd be patrolling for enemy fighters 1 minute and then hitting targets on the ground the next.
That's impressive.
It is.
So they were really living up to that multi-role name.
They were.
And then, of course, there was the war in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
After 9/11,
Yeah.
what were the F-15E's main tasks in Afghanistan?
Well, they were some of the first aircraft over Afghanistan after the attacks. Initially, they focused on hitting key Taliban and al-Qaeda targets, like military bases, supply depots, training camps, even caves where they thought terrorists might be hiding. They really faced very little resistance in those early days because the Taliban didn't have much in the way of air defenses.
I remember reading about those B-2 stealth bombers flying all the way from the U.S. to hit targets in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It really showed how little the Taliban could do to defend their airspace at that time.
Exactly. But as the war went on, the F-15E's role shifted to supporting Allied troops on the ground, providing close air support, taking out enemy positions, protecting troops who were under attack. They flew countless missions, often using their cannons against insurgents, vehicles, and supply convoys.
Wow, that's a really demanding job.
It is.
Close air support requires incredible precision and coordination, especially in a chaotic environment like Afghanistan.
It does.
Are there any particular stories or incidents from the F-15E's time in Afghanistan?
Well, for one thing, the longest fighter mission in history was actually flown by F-15E crews over Afghanistan. It lasted for an incredible 15.5 hours and involved 12 aerial refuelings.
15.5 hours. I can't even imagine being in a fighter jet for that long.
Yeah, it was a record-breaking mission. But there are also some tragic incidents, like the Battle of Roberts Ridge, where an F-15E was involved in a friendly fire incident, accidentally bombing U.S. troops.
Roberts Ridge is a reminder of the terrible things that can happen in war, even with the most advanced technology and highly trained personnel.
It's a tragedy. But despite these challenges, F-15Es continued to fly missions throughout the conflict in Afghanistan, providing crucial support to troops on the ground and attacking important targets. They even shot down an out-of-control MQ-9 Reaper drone in 2009 to stop it from flying into foreign airspace.
A fighter jet shooting down a drone.
It's not something you see every day.
It really shows how versatile the F-15E is.
It does.
Okay, so we've covered Desert Storm, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. What about Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003?
The F-15E played a significant role in that conflict as well.
What were some of their main missions during Iraqi Freedom?
They were tasked with hitting a wide range of targets, important infrastructure, air defenses, even Iraqi aircraft that were still on the ground. Their job was to cripple Saddam Hussein's military as quickly as possible. They even attacked the headquarters of the Iraqi Republican Guard and the Ba'ath Party in Basra, using those massive GBU-24 bunker-busting bombs.
Wow, so they were going right for the heart of the regime.
They were.
And were there any incidents during Iraqi Freedom?
Unfortunately, there was another tragic friendly fire incident. An F-15E accidentally bombed a U.S. Army MLRS unit, resulting in casualties.
It's a reminder of the human cost of war.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about Desert Storm, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraqi Freedom. Were there any other major conflicts or operations where the F-15E was involved?
Well, in 2011, F-15Es took part in Operation Odyssey Dawn, the international intervention in Libya. They enforced the no-fly zone and carried out strikes against Muammar Gaddafi's forces. One aircraft crashed during that operation, but thankfully the crew ejected safely and were rescued.
That's good to hear.
And more recently, F-15Es have been flying missions against ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. As part of Operation Inherent Resolve, they've been involved in long-range strikes against important targets, like the one that killed Abu Nabil al-Anbari, the leader of ISIS in Libya.
So the F-15E is still on the front lines even today.
It is.
It's amazing how relevant this aircraft has remained.
It really is.
And it's not just the U.S. Air Force that flies the F-15E. It's been exported to a number of other countries, right?
Right. That's right. Countries like Israel, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore all operate the F-15E or versions of it.
That's quite a list. So let's talk about those international operators. Do they use their F-15Es in the same way as the U.S. Air Force? Or are there any unique ways they employ them?
Well, Israel, for example, operates the F-15I Ramon, which means thunder in Hebrew. It's essentially their version of the Strike Eagle, but they've added their own unique avionics and systems, including a helmet-mounted sight. They often use it for deep strike missions, almost like a strategic bomber.
The Thunder. It sounds pretty impressive.
It is.
What about South Korea? How do they use their F-15Ks?
South Korea's F-15K is called the Slam Eagle. It's another very advanced variant. And what's interesting is that South Korean companies were heavily involved in its production, which shows how much their aerospace industry has grown.
That's really cool. It's always fascinating to see how different countries adapt and modify these aircraft to fit their specific needs. What about Saudi Arabia? They've been flying F-15s for a long time, haven't they?
They have. They operate the F-15S, which is very similar to the U.S. Air Force's F-15E. And they've also been upgrading their fleet to the more advanced F-15SA standard, which includes a digital fly-by-wire control system, making the aircraft much more responsive to the pilot's commands, and even more hard points for carrying weapons.
They're definitely committed to air power.
They are.
And finally, there's Singapore. What's the story with their F-15SGs?
The Singapore Air Force chose the F-15SG after a very thorough evaluation process, where they considered a number of different advanced fighter jets. And like other F-15E operators, they really value its multi-role capabilities and long-range strike potential.
It seems like the F-15E has really found a home in a lot of different air forces around the world. It's clearly a highly respected and sought-after aircraft.
It is.
And Boeing, the company that now builds the F-15, they haven't just been resting on their laurels. They've continued to develop upgrades and improvements to make sure the Strike Eagle stays relevant and capable in the 21st century.
That's right.
Which makes sense. Technology is always evolving, so even a proven aircraft like the F-15E needs to keep up with the times to stay ahead of the game.
So what kinds of upgrades are we talking about? Are they just minor tweaks, or have there been any major overhauls or proposals for completely new variants?
There have been some pretty significant upgrades. One of the biggest is the new NAB-G82 V1 Active Electronically Scanned Array Radar, or ESA for short. This ESA radar is a huge improvement. It gives the F-15E much greater detection range, better target tracking, And it's more resistant to jamming.
So basically, it can see the battlefield much better.
Exactly.
And that's got to be crucial in modern warfare, where
Yeah.
threats can appear from anywhere at any time.
It is. Another key upgrade is the new ANLQ-250 Eagle Passive Active Warning Survivability System, or EPAWDS-SS, which thankfully is much easier to say.
Sure.
This new electronic warfare system replaces the older TEWS system and gives the F-15E much better protection against enemy radar and missiles.
So it's like they gave it a better shield to
Right.
go along with its upgraded sword.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You mentioned some proposals for new variants or major overhauls. Were there any particularly ambitious or interesting ideas?
There were definitely some intriguing concepts that, for various reasons, never quite made it off the drawing board. One that comes to mind is the F-15G Wild Weasel, which was envisioned as a replacement for the F-4G Wild Weasel in the suppression of enemy air defenses role, or SEAD for short.
See, that's all about taking out enemy radar and missile systems, right?
It is.
It's a critical mission, but also extremely dangerous.
It is. Wild Weasel aircraft are often the first ones into enemy territory, intentionally drawing enemy fire to reveal the locations of their air defense systems so they can be destroyed.
Those are some brave pilots.
They are. So the F-15G was designed with special electronic warfare equipment for this SEAD role, but ultimately it wasn't selected.
What about other proposed variants?
There was one that got a lot of attention, the F-15SE Silent Eagle. It was all about stealth. It had internal weapons bays and radar-absorbent material to make it harder to detect on enemy radar.
A stealthy Strike Eagle. That sounds pretty cool.
It was an interesting concept. It actually generated a lot of interest from countries like Israel, Japan, and South Korea, but ultimately it lost out to the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter in those competitions.
Makes sense. The F-35 was designed from the ground up for stealth,
Right.
while the Silent Eagle was trying to add stealth features to an existing design.
Exactly.
But there's one more proposal that was even more ambitious.
Oh, yeah. The F-15 GSE Global Strike Eagle. This was envisioned as a space-based weapon system, basically an unmanned F-15E that would carry a small satellite launch vehicle and deploy it into orbit.
Wait, are you saying they wanted to launch satellites from a fighter jet?
That was the idea.
Wow, that's crazy. Did it ever actually happen?
No, it never went beyond the concept stage, but it shows how much potential people saw in the F-15E platform.
It really does. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the origins and design of the F-15E to its combat history and the different countries that operate it. What are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listener to remember from this part of the deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand the remarkable evolution of the F-15E. It started as a pure air superiority fighter, but it's transformed into this incredibly capable multi-role aircraft. It can handle intense dogfights 1 minute and then carry out complex ground attack missions the next. It's a testament to the adaptability of the F-15 design and to the ingenuity of the engineers who've continued to refine it over the years.
I agree. It's been amazing to learn about this aircraft. It's so much more than just a machine.
It is.
But as we look to the future, there's a big question we have to ask. With all these new sixth-generation fighter jets being developed, and all the advancements in unmanned aerial systems or drones, how will the F-15E stay relevant in this rapidly changing world of air combat?
That's the big question. And it will be interesting to see how the F-15E adapts to these new challenges. After all, it's always been about pushing the limits. Like that ALASA program, where they tried to use the F-15E to launch microsatellites into space.
Wait, they wanted to launch satellites from a fighter jet?
They did.
Tell me more about that.
Well, in the early 2010s, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the folks who come up with some of the most out-there ideas, they were looking for ways to make space launches cheaper, especially for small satellites. And they came up with this program called ALASA, which stands for Airborne Launch Assist Space Access. Their idea was to attach a small rocket to a modified F-15E, fly it up to a very high altitude, release the rocket, and let it blast off into space carrying a satellite.
So it's like using the F-15E as the first stage of a tiny space launch vehicle.
Yeah, basically.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what happened? Why didn't it work out?
Well, there were a lot of technical challenges, as you can imagine. Combining rockets and fighter jets isn't exactly easy, and in the end, DARPA decided to cancel the program in 2015.
Not too bad.
But it was a really creative idea, and it highlights the fact that the F-15E is more than just a warplane. It's a platform with a lot of potential.
I like that. A platform with potential. So let's talk about the future. What do you see as the biggest challenges for the F-15E in the years to come? And how might it overcome those challenges?
One of the biggest challenges is definitely the increasing use of stealth technology. Fifth-generation fighters like the F-22 and F-35 are becoming more and more common. And the F-15E isn't exactly invisible to radar, so it needs to figure out how to operate effectively in a world where stealth is becoming the norm.
So it's all about staying ahead of the curve,
Yeah.
adapting tactics and technology
Right.
to outsmart the competition.
Exactly.
What are those unmanned aerial systems, the drones? How does the F-15E fit into a future where drones are playing an increasingly important role?
That's a really good question, and it's one that a lot of people are thinking about. Some people believe that manned aircraft like the F-15E will eventually be replaced entirely by drones. Others see a future where manned and unmanned aircraft work together, combining their strengths.
Like a partnership.
Yeah.
So what role could the F-15E play in that kind of partnership?
Well, imagine the F-15E, with its ability to carry a lot of weapons and its sophisticated sensors. Acting as the leader of a group of drones, it could direct their attacks, provide them with real-time intelligence, basically act as their airborne commander.
That's a really cool concept.
It is.
So the F-15E might be getting a bit older, but with the right upgrades and some creative thinking, it could still be a major player in the future of air warfare.
I agree.
It's an impressive aircraft.
It is.
So we've talked about its combat record, its global popularity, even its potential future. Is there anything else we should touch on? Any final thoughts you want to share with our listener?
You know, we've talked a lot about the F-15E's capabilities and its track record. But it's important to remember that behind every mission, every flight, every successful strike, there are human beings. The pilots, the WSOs, the maintenance crews, the support personnel. They're the unsung heroes who keep the Strike Eagle flying and make sure it can do its job.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the technical specs, the firepower, the cool gadgets, but at the end of the day, it's the people who make it all happen.
It is.
And it's their stories, their experiences, their sacrifices that really bring the history of the F-15E to life.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
It's been incredible to explore the world of the F-15E Strike Eagle with you.
Thanks for having me.
Before we wrap up, is there anything you want to leave our listener thinking about? A final thought or question? To spark their curiosity and keep them thinking about the F-15E, even after this deep dive is over.
How about this? We've talked about how the F-15E has adapted and evolved over the years. But what about its core design philosophy? Has that changed? Is it still at its heart? A fighter jet that embodies that not a pound for air-to-ground spirit, even though it's taken on all these multi-role strike missions?
That's a great question. There's no easy answer. And it really gets to the heart of what makes the F-15E so unique.
It does.
It really does. It makes you think about that balance
Yeah.
between staying true to your roots and adapting to a changing world.
Yeah, you're right. And it's a conversation that's probably happening right now in the Pentagon and Air Forces all over the world.
And you know what I love about these deep dives? We don't just try to give you all the answers. We try to give you the information and the insights. You need to form your own opinions and join those conversations.
Exactly. We want to help you ask the right questions and explore these topics on your own.
Okay, so we've talked about how the F-15E has adapted and evolved over time.
Yeah.
But there's this one example that really stands out to me. The ALASA program.
Oh, yeah, alas.
They actually tried to use the F-15E to launch satellites into space.
It was a pretty wild idea.
I mean, how did they even come up with that?
Well, in the early 2010s, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, you know, the folks who always seem to be cooking up those crazy ideas, they were looking for ways to launch small satellites into space more affordably.
Makes sense. Space launches are super expensive.
They are. So they came up with this program called ALASA, which stands for Airborne Launch Assist Space Access. And the basic idea was this. They'd take a modified F-15E, strap a small rocket to it, fly it up to a really high altitude, and then release the rocket, which would then blast off into space carrying a satellite.
So they were basically using the F-15E as like a first stage booster.
Exactly.
That's so cool. So what happened?
Well, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than they initially thought. You know, there were all sorts of technical challenges. Attaching a rocket to a fighter jet is no easy feat.
I can imagine.
So in 2015, DARPA decided to cancel the program.
Oh, that's too bad. But it was a really ambitious idea.
It was.
And it shows how people were thinking outside the box
Yeah.
when it came to using the F-15E.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about the past and the present. Let's look ahead to the future. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the F-15E in the years to come?
That's a tough question. But I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be the rise of stealth technology. You know, fifth-generation fighters like the F-22 and the F-35, they're becoming more and more common. And the F-15E isn't exactly a stealth aircraft.
Right. So how can it compete with those stealth fighters?
That's the question. It's going to need to find ways to operate effectively in an environment where stealth is becoming the norm. That might mean developing new tactics or upgrading its electronic warfare systems to make it harder for enemy radar to detect it.
Okay, that makes sense. What about those unmanned aerial systems, the drones? Everyone's talking about drones these days. How will the F-15E adapt to a future where drones are playing a bigger and bigger role?
That's another great question, and there are a lot of different opinions on this. Some people believe that manned aircraft like the F-15E will eventually be replaced entirely by drones. Others think that manned and unmanned aircraft will work together.
Like a team.
Exactly. And I think that's where the F-15E could really shine.
Well, imagine this.
The F-15E, with its ability to carry a lot of weapons and its advanced sensors, it could act as the leader of a pack of drones.
Okay, I'm listening.
It could direct their attacks, give them real-time intelligence, basically act as their quarterback.
Wow, that's a pretty cool concept. So that F-15E might be getting a little older, but it could still be a very valuable asset in a future conflict.
Absolutely. Has a lot of potential.
It does. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the F-15E's combat record, its global popularity, and even its potential role in future conflicts.
It's been a great conversation.
Before we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? Any final thoughts or questions to leave them pondering?
You know, we've talked a lot about the F-15E's impressive capabilities and its remarkable history, but I think it's important to remember that behind all of that are the people. The pilots, the WSOs, the maintenance crews, all the men and women who work tirelessly to keep this aircraft flying and make sure it can do its job. They're the real heroes.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get caught up in the technology,
Yeah.
but it's the people who make it all happen. It's their dedication and their skill that really make the F-15E such an incredible aircraft.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there a particular question or thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
How about this? We've talked about how the F-15E has adapted and evolved over time, but has its core design philosophy really changed? Is it still at its heart a fighter jet that embodies that not a pound for air-to-ground spirit, even though it's now a multi-role strike aircraft?
That's a really interesting question. It makes you think about what it means to be a fighter
Yeah.
in a world that's constantly changing.
Yeah, it really does. You know, it's like you said earlier, the F-15E kind of embodies that idea of turning challenges into opportunities. It started as this pure air-to-air fighter, but then it evolved to become this multi-role powerhouse.
Exactly. And who knows what the future holds? Maybe it'll even end up launching those satellites into space after all. I wouldn't rule it out. I think our listeners are walking away from this deep dive with a whole new appreciation for the F-15E Strike Eagle. It's an amazing aircraft with an incredible history.
It is.
And I think we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn about this fascinating machine.
There is.
So if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to do some digging on your own. There are tons of great resources out there. Books, articles, documentaries.
You can even visit an air museum and see an F-15E up close.
That's a great idea. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to our expert for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
And to you, our listeners. Thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you on the next one.